The 22nd of December, 1978. Shakti, Russia. As she waited for a ride home, Svetlana Gudankova noticed a young girl in a red coat stood not far from her. Standing beside her was a tall, middle-aged man with large glasses, a long black coat and a shopping bag in his hand. Whilst his appearance was nothing remarkable, what caught Svetlana's eye was the fact he was whispering to the young girl and staring at her. It didn't look like they were relatives or knew one another. He walked away and soon after the young girl went too. Svetlana watched as they walked off and her streetcar arrived. That was the last she saw of them. The following day, the body of a little girl was found in the Grishevka River, and as the news spread, Svetlana went to the police to tell them what she had seen the day before. 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova had been on her way home from school. That day, she had told a friend that she had met a nice old man who would be able to get her imported chewing gum. She had walked with the man to a run-down house, a place he called his secret house. He opened the door and let them both inside before locking the door behind them. Yelena was trapped with a monster and unable to escape. He quickly overpowered her and removed her coat and underwear. She had tried to scream for help, but he stifled her screams with his arm on her neck, and he used the weight of his body to crush her. She eventually stopped moving. He used her scarf to blindfold her as her eyes were still open, before brutally sexually assaulting her. She began to stir and tried to struggle for breath. The man pulled out a large knife and stabbed her 3 times in the abdomen. He then picked up her body and his things and walked across the road to the Grishevka River. He put her body and bag into the icy water and watched as she floated downstream and out of sight. He didn't realise that he hadn't turned the light in the house off, or that Yelena's blood had dripped onto the doorstep. 2 days later, her little body was found. The police brought in a sketch artist and Svetlana gave them a description. A middle-aged, tall, thin man with glasses. That evening, a local man, Alexander Kravchenko, was arrested. He wasn't middle-aged, he was 25, and he didn't wear glasses. He had just served 6 years of a 10-year sentence for the rape and murder of a 17-year-old girl. While he was being interrogated, the police circulated the sketch of the person Svetlana had seen, and one person they showed it to was the principal of a local mining school. He thought he recognised it as being one of his members of staff that taught there, a man called Andrei. The police told him not to tell anyone about it. The search for information fanned out along the river, and 2 officers began to look at the houses across the road, and it was here they found their first clue. Blood on the steps of a small run-down house, a house that still had the light on. They spoke to the neighbours and they confirmed the owner of the house was a man called Andrei. Andrei was brought in for questioning but was very soon let go after his wife had provided him with an alibi. She confirmed that he had been at home with her the whole evening. With that lead seemingly going nowhere, they turned their attention back to Kravchenko. After more questioning, he confessed to killing the little girl. He was tried and found guilty and given 15 years in a labour camp, but for the locals this sentence was not enough and they lodged a complaint. A new judge agreed with the public. Alexander Kravchenko was subsequently sentenced to death and executed in the 1980s. For the police, this was another case solved. Unbeknownst to them, not only had they executed the wrong man, but the real killer had slipped away from right under their noses. By the time of Kravchenko's execution, the real killer had murdered more women and children, and he was on a path of brutality and destruction, the horrors of which many would scarcely be able to believe. Today's case takes us to somewhere we have not been before on Truly Criminal, the Soviet Union. It's always important when looking at criminal cases to examine the wider context and the socio-political backdrop upon which it sits, and this is precisely what makes this particular case so interesting and also so challenging. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was just a decade away from collapse. The regime that had overthrown the ruling Romanov family and hundreds of years of Tsarist rule, pushed Hitler and the Nazi forces back and won the Battle of Berlin, was falling apart at the seams. Decades of repression, purges and famine had blighted its most recent history, and it is against this backdrop that our case begins in the city of Rostov-on-Don. Located around 600 miles south of Moscow and at the time home to 1.4 million people. For reasons that nobody has been able to fully understand, Rostov-on-Don has been home to a disproportionately high number of killers and violent offenders. From 1989 to 1999, 29 multiple murderers and sex offenders were caught, a figure reported in the Moscow Times that made Rostov the serial killer capital of the world. For 12 years, a monster had been stalking the streets of Rostov and beyond, beginning his killing spree in 1978 with Yelena Zakotnova. 3 years later, he would strike again. The 3rd of September, 1981. Larissa Kachenko had run away from boarding school. The 17-year-old was sat at the bus stop outside the Rostov Public Library. She had previously partaken in sex acts in exchange for food, and when a man promised her the same thing, she agreed to go with him. After walking into the woods, he suddenly attacked her and began to tear off her clothes. She attempted to fight back and scream, but he repeatedly punched her in the head, filled her mouth with mud, and then proceeded to strangle her. He mutilated her body, gouged her eyes out, and bit one of her nipples off. He then danced around her body, euphoric about what he had just done, before covering her with leaves and hiding her clothes. The following day, 17-year-old Larissa's body was discovered. June 1982. 13-year-old Lyuba Biryuk had got off the bus, unaware she was being followed. She was abducted and stabbed repeatedly. She was also sexually assaulted and her eyes were mutilated. It would be 2 weeks before her body was found, and due to the brutal summer heat, all that would remain was a skeleton. The killer would strike again in July, killing 14-year-old Lyubov Volobayeva, twice in August when he killed 9-year-old Oleg Pozhdayev and 16-year-old Olga Koprina 3 days apart. 2 victims were killed in September, Irina Karabelnikova and Sergei Kuzmin. The final victim of that year was Olga Stamachenok, who was killed in December. The male victims confused the police, and they believed that this was the work of 2 different killers, but the cases would soon go nowhere. September 1983. Frustrated with the lack of progress, Moscow sent Major Mikhail Fetisov and his team to lead the investigation. Not long after arriving, Fetisov would send a report back to Moscow, and it was withering. The local police were incompetent and unable to deal with the situation, which was obviously the work of one brutal and sadistic killer, dubbed the Forest Strip Killer, who was targeting the vulnerable. What wasn't used, however, was the term serial killer. Any case of a serial killer presents a unique and huge set of challenges, trying to work out a pattern of offending, generating a profile of the killer, seeing if there was anything that linked the victims, but trying to catch a killer in the Soviet Union was a completely different ballgame. Serial killers in the USSR were pretty much unheard of due to a variety of reasons. Information was concealed, and there was a degree of refusal to believe that something like this could happen in a bid to maintain the illusion of public order and everything being okay. A serial killer to them was a Western phenomenon, not something that happened in the Soviet Union. Fetisov requested the help of Viktor Burakov, a highly experienced specialist forensic analyst, to take charge of the investigation in Shakti. The focus of the investigation became looking at those with mental health problems or sexual offences in their criminal history. Despite this new focus, there were new problems. The police used extreme methods of interrogation that often resulted in false confessions. There was a mountain of evidence that continued to stack up, and this led the police to be sure that, based on semen samples taken from the scene, the killer had type AB blood. They also found grey hairs from various crime scenes that were identical. A special task force was put together by Fetisov and his deputy Vladimir Kolyesnikov. The squad would focus their attention on Rostov, especially Shakti, and they would be led by Burakov, who was considered to be one of the best crime scene investigators in the department. With a move to a new office, the Division of Especially Serious Crimes was up and running. Operation Forest Strip had launched. The killer had a pattern. He appeared to target women and children after meeting them at bus stops or train stations. After gaining their trust, he would lure them into nearby woods, where a terrifying attack would take place. The level of brutality was shocking. Victims had their internal organs removed, genitals mutilated, tongues cut out, nipples bitten off, eyes gouged out, and some were decapitated. He also appeared to cannibalize some of his victims. The appalling acts that had been committed against the bodies after death led investigators to believe that maybe these crimes had been carried out by gangs collecting organs, or possibly even Satanists. The authorities began to scour the records of psychiatric hospitals to try and find someone with a similar pattern of behaviour, or with a history of sex offences that were similar. Any person that aroused suspicion was pulled in for questioning, and samples of blood were taken to compare with the semen samples found at the scenes. A suspect by the name of Shabarov was picked up after he was spotted acting suspiciously near the streetcar depot. Shabarov had learning difficulties and told the officers that he had stolen a car with 4 men. He said that he and the 4 others had killed several children. The 5 in total were arrested and intensely questioned over the next 24 hours. They had met at a school for children with additional learning needs and quickly confessed to several of the forest strip killings. In spite of the confession, there was one glaringly obvious problem. They couldn't say where they'd taken place, they couldn't say how many they'd committed, they couldn't even say who the victims were. And as the months passed, the men remained in custody, but the murders continued to happen. Instead of thinking they'd got the wrong men, they believed they were part of a wider criminal gang, and more men with learning difficulties were brought in. The questioning these vulnerable men were subjected to was nothing short of brutal. One of them would end up taking his own life while in custody. As the murders continued, it showed the police the truth they could no longer ignore. They had got it wrong. They were all released. The attention was then turned towards the gay community in Rostov, and they were subject to horrible and discriminatory treatment, as the authorities now believed the killer was a gay man, but this yielded no leads. The police changed focus and then began to look at people who drove for a living, as the killer was able to cover a huge area in a short amount of time. They interviewed those who held a driving licence, more than 150,000 people, and despite the enormous amount of manpower being put into this new theory, it too would go nowhere. With multiple murders and multiple crime scenes, there were so many complexities, and the Soviet system certainly didn't seem to make it easier. Author Robert Cullen, who worked as a correspondent in Moscow for Newsweek and later for The New Yorker, who would also write a book about the case, would later say, like so many other branches of the Soviet system, law enforcement had overlapping bureaucracies. The militia, city police, patrolled the streets and have the responsibility for apprehending the criminals. The procurators, the federal police, had the responsibility for supervising cases and questioning suspects. On paper, the division of labour looked neat enough. In practice, it was blurred. There were lots of opportunities for the two agencies to get in each other's way. In an article by The Observer from 1997, it stated that there was a chronic rivalry between the police and the investigators from the prosecutor's department, which blights difficult cases. There were hundreds involved in the case, and the card index of suspects would reach roughly 15,000 people. The impact this was having on the police force and the wider community was enormous. One policeman who was part of the investigation mentally suffered to such an extent after being exposed to these gruesome killings. He began to hallucinate that the killer was him, and he was murdering in a trance-like state. Another officer would talk of the extreme paranoia he experienced for more than 10 years, not knowing if he was walking past the killer or sat next to him on the bus. Due to decomposition, mutilation, and disfigurement, trying to identify some of the victims was an extremely difficult challenge. So, in August of 1984, the police enlisted the help of an artist to draw sketches of what the victims could have looked like. He drew one of an unidentified female, later revealed to be Lyudmila Alexeyeva. On the 28th of August 1984, 11-year-old Alexander Chappell had been with a friend at a cinema in Rostov. After saying their goodbyes, his friend headed home on the tram, and Alexander waited for his to arrive. His body was found later by a man cutting hay on the banks of the river. September 1984. The police were now years into the investigation, and what did they know? Very little. He was type AB, but so too were many others, so this hardly helped them narrow down the pool to look at, and the killer was not stopping. There had been 11 murders over that summer, but they were still no closer to catching him. As the investigation expanded and the manhunt continued, nearly 200,000 people would be blood tested, and tens of thousands of ex-convicts would be endlessly interrogated. Burakov knew the situation was becoming desperate, and what they had been doing thus far clearly had not been working, so he decided to take a different route. He approached the Rostov Medical Institute's sexual pathologists and psychologists to help him. They needed to create a profile of the killer. Who was he likely to be? Due to the lack of information, many of them refused to work with the police, but luckily, one agreed, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky. This was an unusual decision, as it went outside the guidelines for the Soviet police. The USSR had thus far refused to acknowledge the existence of psychopathic tendencies or sexual deviancy. This meant that Bukhanovsky needed to invent a new methodology to identify the sexual pathologies of this sadistic killer they were hunting. There wasn't much information from the police to work with. They knew that he was probably between 25 and 50 years old, wore size 10 shoes, and was roughly 5'10". 10 days after being brought on board, Bukhanovsky would generate a report that described the man they were looking for as being between 45 and 50 years old. He would be someone that gained sexual satisfaction from death and suffering, a necrosadist. Buchanovsky said that the killer would likely be someone who had a history of sexual problems, and that was why he had enacted such extreme violence on his victims. That was the only way he could become aroused. The killer was likely impotent, and probably with extremely low self-esteem. He would be an educated man, but one with a history of sexual deviancy, and someone unable to make and maintain friendships. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Police presence was upped at transport links and stations, especially the Rostov bus station, as the last 2 victims had disappeared from there. One of those tasked with these patrols was Inspector Alexander Zanosovsky. He stuck to what he knew. The killer always goes back to where he has had success before. He sat at the bus station and would observe until his eyes began to sting and hurt. Within a few days of patrol, he noticed something. A middle-aged man with glasses walking around. He was obviously interested in the young girls at the station. Zanosovsky continued to watch him before going up to him and asking him to identify himself. The man was nervous. He said he used to be a teacher and was just bored. That was why he was talking to the young girls. As Zanosovsky went over his paperwork, he could finally put a name to the face. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. He said he was coming home from a business trip, nothing more than that. As Zanosovsky looked over the paperwork, it revealed he worked freelance for a KGB division, the Department of Internal Affairs. With nothing really to hold him for, his papers were returned to him and he was sent on his way. But Zanosovsky had a bad feeling about the man he had just spoken to. As the patrols continued, Zanosovsky was back out with another investigator. Just as their time on duty was ending, Zanosovsky saw him, the same man from a few weeks before, wearing a black fur hat, Andrei Chikatilo. When I felt it in my guts was when I saw him the second time, weeks later, doing the same thing, and I thought, you won't get away from me. He and his colleague kept their eye on him and watched him from behind a newspaper. As he got onto a bus, so did they. They followed him all day and observed him getting on and off buses around town before heading back to Rostov station. Throughout the day, he had tried to talk to several women and girls who would ignore him, so he would turn his attention to someone else. He sat down in a chair and slept for a couple of hours, and he had no idea that the officers were watching him. He woke up and began talking to a young woman, putting his arm around her. She appeared to be under the influence as he put his hand under her shirt to touch her, which she didn't react to. But just a few minutes later, she was seen talking sternly to him before getting up and walking away. Zanosovsky made his move and stopped him. They told him they had been following him all day. They had watched as he had spoken to and pursued women relentlessly. He was not free to leave. He was under arrest. Suddenly, he was nervous and clearly on edge. Drops of sweat the size of raindrops appeared on his forehead. I had never seen that before, Zanosovsky said. What was in his briefcase? Zanosovsky asked him. A knife, Vaseline, and rope. Usually, the authorities were only allowed to hold a citizen for 72 hours, but this was nowhere near enough time. The decision was made to charge him with harassing women in public places. This was a minor charge and only meant 15 days in custody, but it was better than nothing and gave them time to look into him more. When they checked his files, they realised he was under investigation for theft of supplies from work. The theft of state property was a serious offence, especially for a member of the Communist Party, which he was, and it meant that he could be kept in custody for several months. This added time also gave the authorities an opportunity to do a more thorough background check, and it revealed some very disturbing information. Chikatilo had a sexual interest in children, and the further they dug, the worse it got. He had previously worked as a teacher, but he was unable to control his classes, and both students and other teachers considered him extremely strange. There were a series of complaints made about him regarding inappropriate sexual behaviour and assaults on children at school. He was kicked out of one school in 1974 and then drifted through various educational settings. At one of them, he was in charge of controlling a boys' dorm, but they had no respect for him and ridiculed him endlessly. After a few months, he was caught trying to sexually assault a boy as he slept. Senior students attacked him for this and he ended up carrying a knife around school. He was not reported to the authorities, with one report saying this was likely because a report of this nature would reflect badly on the faculty as a whole. The picture was becoming clearer and the evidence was certainly intriguing. The allegations of voyeurism by students, the assault on the boy in the dorm, allegedly stalking train corridors, owning a deserted house down by the river. This was painting a very damning picture. But just as their hopes were building that they had finally caught their killer, it would all come crashing down around them. When they took a sample of his blood, it was type A. The semen samples of the killer were type AB. The news was crushing. Due to the several outstanding offences, he was sentenced to a year but only served 3 months. He was expelled from the Communist Party upon his release. When he was set free, the police had no idea they had just let their killer go, and he was now free to kill again. But why didn't the DNA from his blood match the DNA from the semen samples? It was later determined that his blood was type A and his semen was type AB, due to him being a non-secretor, meaning his blood type could not be inferred by anything other than a blood sample. If they had taken samples of hair, saliva or semen, they would have had the AB match they needed. Although the Soviet authorities later argued that this was what had happened, one of the leading forensic experts, Edward Blake, theorised that there was simply not enough care when dealing with the samples in the first place. For Zanosovsky, this was not the end. He was sure Chikatilo was the man they were looking for. It all seemed to fit together, but his superiors disagreed. Zanosovsky was demoted for being overly zealous in the performance of his duties. And now Chikatilo was back out and ready to continue his killing spree. The 11th of March, 1985.
This time, the Soviets seem to have opted for a long-term change. The man who took charge within hours of Konstantin Chernenko's death represents a new generation. The transitional period, it would seem, is over. Another Soviet leader who was too old and too sick when he took power to hold on to it has died. And now a 54-year-old has taken over, someone who, theoretically at least, will be around for a generation. Get used to the name, Mikhail Gorbachev.
The tide would begin to turn in the Soviet Union when, upon the death of Konstantin Chernenko, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. With this new leader came glasnost and perestroika, transparency and restructuring across the USSR. It was an attempt to move away from the way things had been done previously, and with that, Moscow assigned Issa Kostova from the KGB Department of Crimes of Special Importance to the case. One of the first things he did was restructure the department into 3 teams, focusing on 3 main areas: Shakhty, Novoshakhtinsk, and Rostov. He had anyone who had been convicted of any sexual offence, whether they were still in custody or not, systematically checked. Nightclubs and X-rated video stores were put under surveillance, and even police officers who had been dismissed for improper conduct were under scrutiny. As they grew more desperate, the police used various tactics to try and catch the killer. Hundreds of officers were deployed undercover, hidden cameras were placed in train stations, and policewomen dressed up as drifters to try and lure the killer out. All of these efforts were in vain. They did catch more than 200 rapists and sexual offenders and other murderers, but not Andrei Chikatilo. August 1st, 1985. Chikatilo had been in Moscow on a business trip, and outside the Domodedovo airport, he met Natalia Poklishtova, an 18-year-old with learning difficulties. She agreed to go for a walk with him. 2 days later, a body was found. She had been stripped and repeatedly slashed and stabbed 38 times. There was also a rope around her neck. She was later identified as Natalia. Her home was just 200 metres away. On the 27th of August, Chikatilo killed again. Another 18-year-old girl, Irina Gulyaeva, was looking for somewhere to sleep. He said that in exchange for sexual favours, he would give her somewhere to stay. The pair went into the woods and he failed to maintain an erection. Irina laughed at him. He responded with extreme violence, stabbing her to death. Her body was found the next day. Armed with the profile of the killer from Bukhanovsky, Burakov decided to go an unusual route. He went to Novocherkassk prison's death row to talk to Anatoly Slivko. Anatoly Slivko was a serial killer and necrophile, responsible for the appalling torture and deaths of 7 boys, and he was awaiting execution. Burakov wanted insight from someone similar to the killer they were searching for, so he decided to interview Slivko. He spoke about how offenders like him were able to evade capture and essentially blend into society without being suspected. December 1985. Helicopters were deployed to patrol the woodlands and railway lines. Plainclothes police officers were out in full force, and a volunteer militia was also drafted in to help. Little did they know, the killer walked among them as a volunteer, pretending to search for the man responsible. He now knew that these areas were the focus for the police, so he moved his crimes further afield. Reports came in from Uzbekistan where 2 very similar murders had been committed. One of the victims had been mutilated to such an extent They thought she had been run over by a combine harvester. May 16th, 1987. Oleg Makarenkov was 13 years old. He was a boarding school student and had been at the railway station when he was lured away and murdered. Another boy was killed the following month, Ivan Bilovetsky, who was murdered in Woodland after being followed. The violence committed against him was so extreme, part of the blade had broken off. Ivan's father found his body the following day. On the 15th of September, a trip took Chikatilo to Leningrad, where he would kill again. 16-year-old Yuri Tereshonok was lured off the train by Chikatilo. His remains would not be found for years. Early 1988. The police presence was still prominent at transport links, but in spite of the officers, the body count would rise by a staggering 19 victims over the next 2 years. The focus of the killer now appeared to be young boys. A lot of the victims had been taken and killed in places far more public, with the risk of being caught significantly higher. Public pressure was building on the police, so patrols were ramped up, and Burakov deployed plainclothes police officers and undercover police officers to areas in an attempt to catch the killer. On the 6th of April 1988, the body of a woman who is still unidentified was found in a vacant lot of a metals factory by a station. She was estimated to be between 22 and 28 years old. She had been disfigured and repeatedly stabbed. As he travelled the country, Chikatilo would kill 8 times over the next year, one even taking place in his daughter's apartment. On the 28th of February 1989, 16-year-old Tatiana Rizhova was inside the apartment with Chikatilo. She was stabbed and then dismembered after he realised he couldn't leave her body there. The body parts were covered and tied to a sled, and he dragged it through the streets to go and dispose of them. A couple of months later in May, Chikatilo murdered Alexander Dyakonov just 1 day after his 8th birthday. It would be on the 14th of July that a taxi driver would find his body. 10-year-old Alexei Mozayev would be abducted from a beach and taken into nearby Woodland and murdered on the 20th of June 1989. Less than a month later, he would kill again. 19-year-old Yelena Varga sat waiting at a bus stop. He offered to walk her home to save her waiting for the bus, and she agreed. He led her into some woodland where he stabbed her to death. Her uterus was cut out and her face was disfigured. After using her clothes to wrap up her body, he set off to his father's birthday party. 10-year-old Alexei Kobatov met Chikatilo outside of a cinema and then vanished. He was murdered and buried in a shallow grave in a cemetery in Rostov. On the 14th of January 1990, 11-year-old Andrei Kravchenko was snatched off the streets of Shakhty, and his body would be found just over a month later. On the 7th of March, Yaroslav Makarov had skipped school and gone to the train station. From here, he would vanish. Chikatilo would murder him in the botanical gardens and viciously mutilate his body. Yaroslav was found the next day. Andrei Chikatilo had now killed more than 40, and he showed no signs of stopping. Less than a month later, Lyubov Zayeva, 31 years old, was travelling to Shakhty. Her skeletal remains would not be found until August. On the 28th of July, 13-year-old Viktor Petrov was waiting for the early morning bus when he disappeared. His murder took place in the botanical gardens, just a few feet from where Yaroslav was killed. On the 17th of August, the body of 11-year-old Ivan Fomin was found. He had been murdered 3 days before at a Novocherkassk municipal beach after he had gone into some woodland to get changed. He was stabbed 42 times and mutilated. 16-year-old Vadim Gromov, a student with learning difficulties, went missing after riding a train on the 17th of October 1990. Just 2 weeks later, Chikatilo killed Viktor Tashenko, who was 16 years old. Viktor had fought hard and broken his murderous finger. He'd also bitten him. This day there hadn't been any patrols due to a shortage of staff, when it had been previously heavily watched for months until that point. When speaking to employees at the station, one recalled that when Viktor purchased his ticket, he had done so with a tall man with grey hair and glasses. The employee said that her daughter had seen the same man a year ago. She'd listened as the man had been speaking to a boy on the train and tried to convince him to come with him, but the boy had refused to go and ran away. The police interviewed the daughter, and she not only gave a solid description, but she said he was always at the station and on the trains trying to talk to young people. The last known victim was Svetlana Korostik, a 22-year-old homeless woman who was murdered in Woodland on the 6th of November 1990. Her body was found 7 days later. Her nipples had been bitten off and she'd been covered in dirt. After this, as Chikatilo walked back to the station, stood on the platform was Sergeant Igor Rybakov. He watched as this tall, sweaty, bespectacled man staggered out of the woods. He quietly observed and moved a bit closer. The man had a bandage on his finger and blood on his ear and cheek. Sergeant Rybakov approached him and told him to give him his papers, but just as he was going to ask him more, the train arrived. It was deemed that there wasn't a real reason to keep him there, so he was allowed to board the train and leave. Rybakov did file a report about the encounter, and just a few days later a body was found near the station, that of Svetlana Korostik, and the policeman remembered the odd man he had spoken to. A witness said he had seen the same man trying to force a boy off a train. When looking back over the files, they wanted to know if anyone had been acting strangely or in any way that drew them attention, and one name from Sergeant Rybakov's report stood out: Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. Generalissa Kostoev asked the officers to check where Chikatilo was on the 14th of May 1988. They knew for a fact that one of the victims had been killed that day in Ilovaisk. His work record showed that he had been there that day too. This was now starting to slot together. His strange behaviour, his description fitting the ones that witnesses had given, his history of sexual abuse. They knew they needed to find Chikatilo before he struck again. The 20th of November 1990. Chikatilo went to get his finger x-rayed after it had been broken by Viktor Tishenko. He then went to buy some beer and noticed a young boy whom he tried to speak to. He was quickly scared off when a woman appeared. He tried to talk to another boy who was soon called back by his mother. Then, it happened. 3 plainclothes police officers walked up to him and took him into custody. He was carrying a briefcase with him, which contained a knife, Vaseline and rope, the same items he had been carrying when he was arrested in 1984. He was now back in custody and the arrest was caught on film. He sat in the car and didn't say a single word as he was taken to Mikhail Fetisov's office at the Department of Internal Affairs. While he sat in custody, officers went straight over to his house to search it, and what they found painted a very dark picture. A hammer, more than 20 knives, and a pair of shoes that matched the footprints found at the scene of a murder of an unidentified woman were found. He was processed and photographed and then put straight into isolation. As he sat in his cell, many wondered, who was Andrei Chikatilo? The police initially had dismissed the report that Bukhanovsky had generated about who the killer would likely be, but upon Chikatilo's arrest, it had proven to be eerily accurate. He was 54 years old, impotent, isolated, had a history of allegations of sexual abuse, and few friends. (1936) Yabloknoye, Ukraine. The population had been through and was still suffering the effects of a devastating famine following Joseph Stalin's enforcement of collectivization. On the 16th of October that year, a baby boy was born, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. Just a few years later, the situation in the USSR would become even tougher when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. According to the National World War II Museum, the USSR would lose 24 million people in the conflict. His father, Roman, was conscripted, but was later captured by the Nazi forces and held prisoner. In 1943, Chikatilo's sister was born while his father was away. The family lived in a tiny one-room house, so it was reported that potentially his mother had been the victim of a sexual assault by a Nazi soldier, and Chikatilo had witnessed it. Roman would eventually be released after the war, but the stigma of having been captured and his perceived cowardice followed him, and Andrei would also be the subject of bullying as a result. He was only a child when his father came home, but he too criticised his father's alleged betrayal to his country. As a child, Andrei would not typically play with other children, preferring to be by himself reading, with a particular interest in stories of Soviet partisans who had captured and tortured German prisoners. He was already the target of bullies, and despite having extremely poor vision, he refused to wear glasses, fearing they would make him an even bigger target. His excellent reading skills and memory saw him become the political information officer, and he was also the editor of the school newspaper. He had little to no social life, and he had even less experience with girls. The young Chikatilo struggled with crippling shyness and isolation. When he was 15, he had his first sexual experience with a girl. He overpowered her, and during a quick struggle, he ejaculated. This encounter led to him being bullied more, and solidified the combination for him. Sexual pleasure and extreme violence went hand in hand. It's believed that when Chikatilo was born, he suffered a buildup of excess fluid, putting pressure on his brain. It's believed that this led to genital urinary tract problems that were apparent in his childhood, teens, and adulthood. He wet the bed until he was in his teenage years, and would fail to sustain an erection, although he was able to ejaculate. He went on to take part in national service between 1957 and 1960, and following this, he relocated to Rodionovo Nesvetayevsky. After saving his money, his parents and sister moved in with him, and his sister was worried by his stunted love life. So she arranged for him to meet a girl, and the pair would marry in 1963. In spite of Chikatilo's sexual problems and his apparent lack of interest in sex, the pair would go on to have a son and a daughter, and all appeared relatively normal for the family. He enrolled at the Rostov Liberal Arts University, and in 1970 he left his job as a telephone engineer and began working at a school, having gained his degrees in engineering, Russian literature, and Marxist-Leninism. But this job would not last long. After the allegations began to swirl around him about attempted sexual assaults, abuse, and acts of voyeurism, he was out. In 1978, he ended up at vocational school number 33 in Shakhty. He would then buy a small, run-down house opposite the Grishevka River. This would be where he would take his first victim, Yelena Zakotnova. It would also be his boss that had told the police the sketch of the suspect Svetlana had seen talking to Yelena looked like his employee named Andrei. After killing Yelena, Chikatilo would go quiet, and there would be no reported victims for the next 3 years. During this time, he couldn't hold down a job after repeated allegations of sexual abuse, and he was eventually dismissed from the mining school in 1981. Following this, he began to work as a clerk at a raw materials factory in Rostov, and this job allowed him to travel for work looking for factory supplies. It gave him more access to potential victims. But what about his wife? Had she known anything? Senior investigator Amakon Yandiev, who had joined the team in 1985, said to her, "It can't be that you didn't know. He would come home dirty as an animal, bloody. You must have known." But she emphatically denied any knowledge of his crimes. "If I had known what my husband was doing, I would have done something to stop him. But how was I to know?" she said. He'd told his wife that his clothes had become dirty, as work would get him to load filthy crates. Yandiev added that Chikatilo appeared to be somewhat afraid of his wife, cowering if she even raised her voice at him. And now this man was sitting in isolation, having finally been apprehended, and the relief was palpable. However, for those who had been on the case, the 500 police officers and 50 investigators, this, quite frankly, had been nothing short of a disaster and embarrassment. Charges of violations relating to the botched investigations were brought against detectives, but it remains to be seen if any of them were actually punished. In spite of the huge police presence, relentless and often brutal interrogations, the undercover officers, etc., he had always been one step ahead. Amakon Yandiev said that the law enforcement bodies were at fault mainly in that they relied too much on the biological facts. What did we learn? That you have to check anyone. He added, "Nobody connected to this case has anything to boast about." For Colonel Alexander Zanosovsky, who had arrested Chikatilo in 1984 and then been demoted, his feelings had been proven absolutely right. Am I mad? When it finally came out that it was him, I was very mad indeed. How can you not be mad when so many more women and children died? November 21st, 1990. The interrogation of Andrei Chikatilo began. In charge of the questioning was Issa Kostoyev, but he was getting nowhere. Chikatilo was not admitting to anything. A week later, the accused wrote to the Prosecutor General of Russia. It read in part, "I felt a kind of madness and ungovernability in perverted sexual acts. I couldn't control my actions, because from childhood I was unable to realise myself as a real man and a complete human being." It wasn't a confession by any means, but it was the most he'd said so far. The following day, he would admit to something. Not the murders, but to sexually assaulting the students he used to work with. The next day, another letter arrived to the Prosecutor General. "My inconsistent behaviour should not be misconstrued as an attempt to avoid responsibility for any acts I have committed. One could argue even after my arrest I was not fully aware of their dangerous and serious nature. My case is peculiar to me alone. It is not a fear of responsibility that makes me act this way, but my inner psychic and nervous tension. I am prepared to give testimony about the crimes, but please do not torment me with their details, for my psyche would not be able to bear it. It never entered my mind to conceal anything from the investigation. Everything which I have done makes me shudder. I only feel gratitude to the investigating bodies for having captured me." But he still wasn't giving them what they needed. A confession to the murders. Kostoyev asked Dr. Buchanovsky to help in the interview. He agreed as long as the notes he made were not used for evidence. The 30th of November, 1990. Dr. Buchanovsky told Chikatilo that he believed his actions were rooted in mental illness. He also told him he would be willing to talk to his family to help them understand what was going on. He explained that they were trying to understand the killer from a scientific point of view, and finally, the tactics started to pay off. Chikatilo, obviously feeling flattered by the approach, began to talk. Buchanovsky had Chikatilo's wife come in, and this resulted in the first display of emotion from the accused. He broke down in tears. He read the report that Buchanovsky had made detailing the profile of the killer. "Yes, it's me," he cried. A few days later, on the 5th of December, finally he would confess. Once he began to talk, he wouldn't stop. He had been accused of 36 murders, but he said this was wrong. He admitted to the rape and murders of 56 women and children. Finally, after a 12-year reign of terror, the butcher of Rostov, the Rostov Ripper, the Forest Strip killer, Andrei Chikatilo had been caught. He would take the officers to the sites of many of the murders and revealed previously undiscovered bodies. He said that he had greatly resented the sexual activity that he alleged he saw amongst drifters in the area. It was a painful reminder to him of his own sexual problems, and I began to wonder whether these low-class elements have the right to exist, he said. He spoke about his modus operandi. With his female victims, he would tell them he knew a shortcut to a different station, or promise them food if they went with him. With the boys, he would offer them chewing gum, or the promise of watching a horror film or pornography. I'd just say to all of them, "Let's go, let's have something to eat or whatever." They were everywhere at every stop. I didn't have to search for them. He said that once they got into the woods, I would start to shake. It was like a fever. On the 7th of December, he was taken to Shakti and led officers to an unmarked shallow grave. He was filmed as he stood cold and emotionless as the police dug and revealed a child's shoe. For the officers, watching the remains of Alexei Kobatov being recovered was haunting. Chikatilo also admitted to murdering Yelena Zakotnova in 1978, a crime for which Alexander Kravchenko had already been executed. Using a mannequin, he would also show them how he had killed his victims. One of the most gruesome aspects of this case were the allegations of cannibalism. Chikatilo was fascinated by cannibalism, and this was something that had gone back to his childhood. He had been told by his mother that during the famine in the 1930s, his older brother had been kidnapped, murdered, and eaten by those who were starving. Buchanovsky spoke about this and the impact this story had had on Chikatilo. He found out about it when he was 4. He reacted with such terror to the idea that it was possible to kidnap and eat a child, that he remembered it all his life. On the one hand, he found it terrible and frightening. On the other, he had an unhealthy interest in it. This story of his older brother does remain unconfirmed, and we will likely never know if it is actually true. Andrei Chikatilo was tested and examined for 8 weeks at a psychiatric hospital in Moscow. Andrei Kravchenko led the examinations, and he described someone who had abnormal development from childhood, influenced by his experiences of war, poverty, and famine. He said that Chikatilo had explained that the more time went on, the less he cared about the gender of his victims, and more so about the power and control he could exert over them. He had gouged out the eyes of many of them due to the belief that what the victim had last seen would be imprinted on their eyes. Buchanovsky said that Chikatilo was classed as a schizoid psychopath, with the term schizoid being used because he imagined himself in lofty roles like a partisan, but in real life he called himself an idiot, a good-for-nothing. He also said that there must be a biological root for Chikatilo's behaviour, and although it was not clearly defined or understood, he said it appeared to show a predisposition for some to commit certain offences. Buchanovsky said that it had not been his intention to murder his first victim, Yelena Zakotnova, but due to the overwhelming sexual pleasure, killing became his goal, to try and recreate that experience. Andrei Chikatilo was found fit to stand trial, but he appealed, saying that the psychiatric evaluation was biased. In spite of strange lesions on Chikatilo's brain, and against the advice of Buchanovsky, no insanity plea was permitted. It was argued he had planned the murders, carried weapons and rope with him as he had travelled, targeted the most vulnerable, and successfully avoided being caught for more than a decade. It was determined he was indeed fit to stand and would soon go on trial. The 26th of December 1991. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally dissolved. This meant that Andrei Chikatilo's upcoming trial would be one of the first major ones in a post-Soviet era. But for Alexander Kravchenko, the man who had been wrongfully executed for a murder he did not commit, it was too late. In 1991, Russia's Supreme Court posthumously rescinded his sentence. The 14th of April, 1992. The trial began. Standing in the dock with his head shaved, the 57-year-old former head teacher and father of two stood accused of some of the most depraved crimes one could imagine against society's most vulnerable. Throughout it, Andrei Chikatilo was confined to a metal cage, not to protect the public, but to protect him from them. The court was filled with the bereaved, the devastated, the angry, those whose loved ones had been so cruelly and brutally taken from them. Knowing that they would likely have torn him limb from limb, he was kept in the cage surrounded by guards to stop that from happening. Cameras and reporters were also allowed in a very unusual move. Just to read out what Chikatilo had been accused of took Judge Leonid Akobzhanov 2 days with more than 200 files to read from. The nature of the crimes was so graphic, some in the courtroom fainted, and even some of the guards were so overwhelmed that they needed to sit down. After the charges were read out, Andrei Chikatilo was allowed to address the court, and he did so for nearly 2 hours. He described himself as someone who had been persecuted and suffered since childhood. He said he had been mocked over his sexual problems, and this, combined with going away constantly for work and having issues at work, all led to this devastating result. I dreamed of a big political career, he said, and ended up with this nothing life, in stations and on trains. This rambling speech was just the beginning. His bizarre behaviour included singing, talking nonsense, and at one point even pulling his trousers down and exposing himself to the court. Many saw this as an attempt to present himself as mentally ill. Throughout the trial, the judge used powers afforded to him under the legal system to interrogate Chikatilo. He asked repeatedly for him to explain why he had done what he had done, and how he could be so bereft of empathy for those whom he had hurt. Don't you imagine what excruciating pain it caused your victims when you bit off their tongues? I've seen hundreds of corpses, but I've never seen anything like this. We want to understand your psychology. Were you thinking I can make anyone I want a victim or what? For 1 minute of pleasure, you demanded the life of a child. Didn't you think about that? Chikatilo mumbled back. I can't explain. One person from the public gallery called him a damned soul and an evil sadist. Lydia Kobatova, the mother of 10-year-old Alexei, whom Chikatilo had abducted and murdered on the 28th of August 1989, said they should rip him apart like a dog. I hope he dies the most horrible death like my son did. As tensions rose, the courtroom soon began to smell of valerian drops, a tranquilizer distributed by the court-appointed nurses. The court heard how many of the victims were poor or sex workers. They'd been lured into surrounding forests with the promise of food and money. Other victims were teenagers or children, who upon seeing a kind-looking stranger had asked him for help. Many were runaways or drifters, so society would not immediately notice their disappearance. He would also target orphans and those with learning difficulties. Paulina Ishatina, whose daughter was one of his victims, said, "Why bother trying him? If they gave him to me, I'd tear him apart. I'd gouge his eyes out and cut him up. I'd do everything to him that he did to my daughter. My daughter had 46 knife wounds, her womb was cut out. Why did he do that? What did he need with it? I can't understand it. It all just won't fit into my head. Every day we talk through it all and it still doesn't make sense. How can you torment someone like that?" The judge said he had mutilated the bodies to give himself the illusion of having performed a real sexual act. He received sexual satisfaction after he knifed a person and saw blood, when a victim suffered. With no sign of remorse in his voice, he described himself as a crazed wolf, saying he just turned into a beast, into a wild animal. He said that he would use what he referred to as his magnetism to ensure his victims would follow him into the woods. Then, overwhelmed with excitement, he would ambush them. When I used my knife, it brought psychological relief. I know I have to be destroyed. I understand. I was a mistake of nature. Bukanovsky said he understands that what he did was bad, that he killed people, but that doesn't mean he's sorry. The judge appealed to his conscience, but he's only sorry for himself. He would continuously disrupt proceedings in court, which led to him being taken out. Due to his constant outbursts, most of the evidence would be heard without him. When he was brought back in, there was one thing the judge agreed with him on: the refusal of the Soviet Union to acknowledge that serial killers were such a thing in the USSR had enabled him to evade capture for as long as he did. The trial would go on until August, and when it was time for the court to retire to consider their verdict, a man in the public gallery threw a bar through the cage, and it missed Chikatilo's head by a matter of inches. The man in question was taken out of court by the guards, but soon after released. The verdict arrived 2 months later, in October 1992. Judge Leonid Akobzhanov read out the findings to the court. It was 330 pages long. His voice broke with emotion as he did this. The judge also heavily criticised the police, saying that their incompetence had meant it had taken them so long to catch Chikatilo. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 of the 53 counts of murder. His victims included 21 boys ranging from 8 to 16, 14 girls aged between 9 and 17, and 17 women who were 18 and older. His crimes had been committed in southern Russia, Uzbekistan and Ukraine, and spanned the course of 12 years, from 1978 to 1990. Every guilty verdict came with a separate death sentence. The court, packed with some 200 people, erupted in applause.
Учитывая чудовищные злодеяния, что он творил, судебная коллегия не может не назначить ему единственное наказание, которое он заслуживает, исключительную меру наказания, и приговаривает его к смертной казни.
As the verdicts were read out, Chikatilo shouted from inside his cage, "Why me? I demand the podium. Get me a lawyer. I didn't confess to anything. Show me the corpses." From inside his cage, he kicked over his wooden bench and called the judge a swindler and a conman. He was led out of court as a result. And with that, the trial was over. Chikatilo was now awaiting the day of his execution. Although he continued to appeal it, the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, refused a final appeal. The sentence was final. While on death row, Chikatilo gave an interview. He said, "I'm nothing but an actor who's performed a role to earn an Oscar and get into the Guinness Book of Records, that's all. Could the person who's written the scenario for all of this explain it to the people? I am asked, describe how it all happened. But what can I explain when they didn't show me the case file? They hid it, they're hiding it all. They've put great things in there, painting me as a beast. That's all. And now people look at me. They must put up with me here." Following his conviction, Andrei Chikatilo's wife and children would change their names and move away from the area. The 14th of February, 1994. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was taken from his cell and executed with a bullet to the back of the head. Following the investigation, when serial killers continued to come out of Rostov, investigators used what Bukanovsky had put in place in the new killer department, which had emerged from the team who had pursued Chikatilo. Dr. Bukanovsky would later be given an award from Moscow for services in the hunt for serial killers. The story of the hunt for Andrei Chikatilo has been told in countless books, television shows and films, all from varying points of view, highlighting not only the complexities of the case, but how he was able to evade capture for as long as he did. Films like 1995's Citizen X, showing the bureaucratic problems that face the investigators trying to track the killer down, and books like The Killer Department by Robert Cullen, upon which that film is based. The level of destruction that Andrei Chikatilo caused is really impossible to fully comprehend. People were relentlessly and wrongly pursued. Many were mercilessly interrogated. So many lives were ruined as a result. One person had been wrongly executed, one suspect had made an attempt to end his life, and another had taken his own life. It's genuinely difficult to know what to say when bringing a case like this one to a close. We will likely never know the true extent of his offending. The least we can do is remember his victims and those left behind. More than 50 women and children, human beings with hopes and dreams, treated with such disgraceful inhumanity, it is hard to even put into words.